Hi, this is Daniel, and you're watching Unrivaled Investing. This is a no hype, mission focused channel trying to find you exceptional companies and unrivaled investments. Just this past week, George Soros penned an op ed talking about some of the key risks he sees developing in China. And the reason why I think it's really important to listen to what big actors like George Soros have to say, big players like Ray Dalio, George Soros, Michael Burry, is because they have the track record to back it up. And he is one of the most successful global macro traders of all time. The piece that he wrote is worth reading in its entirety, but there are two main points of concern I think that investors should consider. It's broadly talking about how Xi Jinping's dictatorship threatens the Chinese state. In his quest for personal power, he's rejected Deng Xiaoping's economic reform path and turned the Communist Party into an assemblage of yes men. And the two key points of concern, let me read this paragraph, and it's fairly obvious what they are, is one, relations between China and the US are rapidly deteriorating and may lead to war. Whoa! Mr. Xi has made clear that he intends to take possession of Taiwan within the next decade. This is a red line, a geopolitical red line, and he is increasing China's military capacity accordingly. He also faces an important domestic hurdle in 2022 when he intends to break the established system of succession to remain president for life. This would be another huge change in China. He feels that he needs at least another decade to concentrate the power of the one-party state and its military in his own hands. He knows that his plan has many enemies, and he wants to make sure they won't have the ability to resist him. I mean, these are potentially huge developments. George Soros isn't necessarily right, but they're both, if he's even marginally correct on one of these, it has huge global ramifications. So let's discuss each of these. Where the first is, if you have war, I think the reality is it's very similar to the nuclear war drills that kids faced in the 1950s, 1960s, where you crouch down, tuck your head, and effectively kiss all your assets goodbye. Because if there's a war, a global war between a hot war between two global nuclear powers, I mean, that is a huge reset. That is a huge problem. Hopefully, God forbid something like that happens, because that, no matter what sort of risk on asset you have, it is risk off that next day where everything just sort of falls apart. So I seriously hope George Soros is 100% wrong on this. It's also a no-win situation where even if the US were to best China in a conflict, it didn't, resort to, let's say, nuclear weapons, it'd still leave a billion plus folks with a lot of resentment. So my view, and a huge, China would be one of the largest economies in the world. So no matter what, I just view this as like, these are red lines in the sand. It's no-win scenarios, huge risk off. It strikes me as a lose-lose situation for both parties. I just don't see this situation playing out, even if George Soros thinks it's a risk that's developing. So it might be, the probability might be increasing. I just don't think it's still likely to come to pass. His other key, aspect is this key man risk, which Xi Jinping effectively becoming a dictator. And if that, it is true, and you start seeing effectively in the China morphing from one party state to effectively a one man system where Xi Jinping, is sole power. If you have that type of power consolidation, I'd argue it's even more important to make sure, if you have Chinese investments, that from a portfolio perspective, these companies align broadly with the party's mandates in terms of what they've articulated so far. Now, keep in mind, if this were to come to pass and you were to see a situation where Xi Jinping, effectively says, hey, I'm going to remain president for life, if you have that sort of situation, I do think you have a valuation haircut with China, because you just have higher geopolitical risk, you have higher social disruption risks within China. This increases China's fragility because now it's not a party, it's a man. It creates a lot more problems, I'd argue, for everyone, including investors. And one example, and I'd say this is only peripherally related to the problems that George Soros has articulated, is that just in the last week, or actually the last few weeks, China's been talking about cracking down effectively on real estate. And here it is, this Wall Street Journal article talking about how China's corporate crackdown adds to junk bond distress. And this is one example of the financial stress we've seen, where government campaign to reduce debt in sectors such as real estate, think Evergrande, has put many developers in tight spots, sending high yield bond prices tumbling. And you could see how these junk bond prices, these are generally the lowest tier bonds that you have. Blue lines US, red lines China. You see how they moved in lockstep in terms of the global crisis that had started happening in March 2020, when folks started waking up and saying, hey, this COVID, this is a real pandemic. But here it is. It's interesting enough to see how China has really moved separately from the US in the last few months. And I think this is part of the broad regulatory crackdown. And, this is a huge spike in rates, effectively, where junk bonds are yielding, mid-teens rate. And so some could view this as a warning sign. Others could view this as an opportunity. I'm not interested in getting into the China real estate sector, but I could view this generally as a risk off that you're looking at with Chinese assets. When you see this sort of saying, hey, there's this regulatory crackdown, there are players out there that are in financial trouble. There are players out there that have made a bunch of bad real estate investments and they have this debt and they're going to have trouble paying it off. But when you start seeing broad categories like high yield bonds stepping into double digits, that does start making me think, oh, okay, is this potentially blood on the streets in terms of asset prices? And could this be a potential opportunity? And that sort of does fit with what I'm seeing so far, at least how I'm personally investing, where I've got about a basket of Chinese stocks, about 25% of my portfolio. I've invested in the Hong Kong shares using Interactive Brokers. I've done a detailed dive on Alibaba, as well as an updated quarterly update. For those that are interested, Alibaba is one of my holdings, in full disclosure. And so, I'm personally just sitting tight and watching this play out. I'm not the type of person to say, oh my goodness, risk on, and now I'm going to sell at a discount. I'm more like, well, wait a second, let's focus on the compounding that's actually going on with these companies. Could I be wrong? Could these geopolitical risks actually derail the thesis? Yeah, and I'd argue that's the weakness to the upside downside valuation framework that I usually use, which is like, hey, I'm thinking about this from a company perspective. What if you have something, a geopolitical risk that completely derails the thesis, that completely, disrupts this? And at this point, I still think it's not likely. That's part of the reason why I have this basket, and I've added to it in recent weeks, is because I look at this and I'm like, yeah, this means risk off. This means that's the time to be adding capital, at least I think. Do I think this is going up to 20, 30, 40%? I'd be surprised. That's my view, is when people start panicking or when it starts seeming like risk off, that's personally when I'm buying. And if you completely disagree with me, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you want to follow my personal journey, go to unrivaledinvesting.com. First week of the month, I call it my full portfolio. By the end of the month, I call it a potential multi-bagger for my Journey subscribers. And then I also have an exclusive Discord community where we're interacting on a daily basis. If this video talking about the key risks George Soros sees going on with China, if that's been helpful for you, please make a point of subscribing. Hit that thumbs up button. Thanks so much for watching.